What happens when a racist cop handcuffs a black student without reason only to find out he's arrested the police chief's son? This emotional story dives deep into the harsh reality of racial profiling, the abuse of power, and the fight for justice. Watch as a father's unwavering determination exposes prejudice and sparks a powerful reckoning. This isn't just a story, it's a wake-up call. You won't believe how it ends. It was a crisp autumn morning in the suburbs, and Jason Carter, a bright and ambitious black high school senior, was on his way to meet his friends at the local coffee shop. Jason was known around school for his dedication to academics and sports. Despite his achievements, he was often cautious when out in public, fully aware of the prejudice that still lingered in society. Jason carried a backpack filled with school books and a laptop, symbols of his hard work and future aspirations. Today he wore a hoodie with the logo of his school's basketball team, proudly representing the team he had captained to the regional finals. But in the eyes of some, his achievements were overshadowed by something he couldn't control: his skin color. A few blocks away, Officer Thomas Bradley sat in his patrol car. Known for his quick judgments and an often unspoken bias, Thomas prided himself on keeping the streets safe, but his idea of safety was often clouded by prejudice. When he saw Jason walking alone, he immediately felt a pang of suspicion. To Thomas, Jason fit the vague description of a suspicious person he had heard over the radio earlier. Thomas followed Jason down the street, his patrol car creeping along the curb. Jason noticed the car but brushed it off, focusing on his destination. He'd encountered situations like this before: unwanted attention simply for existing. Suddenly, the sound of the patrol car's speaker blared, startling Jason. "Hey you, stop right there," Thomas called out, his tone sharp and authoritative. Jason froze, his heart racing. He turned slowly, raising his hands slightly to show he wasn't a threat. "Is there a problem, officer?" he asked, his voice steady but cautious. Thomas stepped out of the car, his hand resting on his holstered gun. "What are you doing in this neighborhood?" he demanded. "I'm just heading to the coffee shop," Jason replied calmly. "I live nearby." Thomas squinted at Jason, his gaze falling to the backpack. "What's in the bag?" "Books, my laptop." "School stuff," Jason answered. "Mind if I take a look?" Thomas asked, though it didn't sound like a question. Jason hesitated. He knew his rights, but he also knew the risks of asserting them in this situation. "Sure," Jason said, reluctantly handing over the bag. Thomas rummaged through it, his expression growing more frustrated as he found nothing incriminating. Yet, he wasn't ready to let Jason go. "I'm going to need you to come with me," Thomas said, reaching for his handcuffs. Jason's eyes widened. "What? Why? I haven't done anything wrong." "You match the description of someone we're looking for," Thomas replied vaguely, cuffing Jason despite his protests. Passers-by began to notice the commotion, some pulling out their phones to record. Jason felt a mix of fear and humiliation as Thomas pushed him toward the patrol car. Unbeknownst to Thomas, Jason's father, Chief David Carter, was just a few miles away at the police station, wrapping up a morning briefing. Chief Carter was a respected leader known for his fairness and integrity. When his phone buzzed with a video message from a concerned resident, he opened it to see his son being unjustly arrested. Chief David Carter stared at his phone, disbelief and anger washing over him. He played the video again, his heart sinking as he watched his son, Jason, being handcuffed and pushed into the back of a patrol car. David had dedicated his life to building trust between the police force and the community. Seeing his own son subjected to such treatment was both personal and professional devastation. He immediately called the precinct. "This is Chief Carter. I need to know which officer is patrolling near Maple Street," he said, his voice firm but controlled. "Officer Thomas Bradley is in that area," Chief replied the dispatcher. David clenched his fist. "Have him bring the suspect he just detained to the station immediately. I want him in my office within the hour." Meanwhile, Jason sat in the back of the patrol car, his mind racing. He'd always been proud of his father's work as a police chief, but in this moment, all he could feel was frustration and fear. He thought about the times his father had told him to stay calm in situations like this, to avoid escalation. But even with all the advice and precautions, Jason found himself in cuffs for no reason other than someone's prejudice. Officer Thomas Bradley drove in silence, unaware of the firestorm awaiting him at the station. To him, this was just another routine stop, another box ticked in his self-assigned mission to keep order. He didn't bother asking Jason any further questions or explaining the situation. His mind was set. Jason fit the profile he had conjured in his head. When they arrived at the station, Thomas escorted Jason inside, the young man still handcuffed, Other officers in the precinct glanced at the scene, some frowning but saying nothing. They knew Chief Carter wouldn't take this lightly. Thomas led Jason to a holding area, his grip firm on Jason's arm. As they entered, they were met by Chief Carter, standing tall and imposing in the hallway. His uniform was immaculate, his expression unreadable. Officer Bradley, David began, his tone cold and measured. "Step into my office, now." Thomas blinked, momentarily confused. "Sir, I was just bringing in a suspect." "I said now," David interrupted, his voice leaving no room for argument. Inside the office, David closed the door and turned to face Thomas. "Do you know who that young man is?" he asked, his voice low but charged with emotion. Thomas shrugged. "He matches the description of a suspect we're looking for." David leaned in closer, his eyes locked on Thomas. "That young man is my son." Thomas froze, his face draining of color. I didn't know, sir." "That's the problem," David shot back. "You didn't know, and yet you assumed. You saw a young black man walking in his own neighborhood and decided he must be a criminal. Did you ask him any questions? Did you verify his story?" Thomas stammered, I was just doing my job." "No," David interrupted sharply. "Your job is to protect and serve, not to harass and profile. Do you have any evidence that links my son to this so-called suspect you're searching for?" Thomas looked down, unable to meet David's piercing gaze. "No, sir." David took a deep breath, reining in his anger. "This isn't just about my son, Officer Bradley. This is about every person in this community who has been judged unfairly because of the color of their skin. You've embarrassed this department, and you've made a mockery of everything I've worked to build here." Thomas opened his mouth to respond, but David held up a hand. "We're not done here. Go wait in the briefing room. I'll deal with you shortly." As Thomas left, David turned his attention to Jason, who had been brought into the office by another officer. The cuffs had been removed, but the marks they left on Jason's wrists were still visible. David's heart ached as he looked at his son. "Are you okay?" he asked gently. Jason nodded, though his expression was tight. "I'm fine, Dad. But this isn't just about me. This happens to people all the time." David placed a reassuring hand on Jason's shoulder. "You're right, and that's why we're going to address it together." Chief David Carter sat down with Jason in his office, the weight of the moment pressing down on him. He could see the frustration and hurt in his son's eyes, emotions that mirrored his own. David had spent years trying to reform the police department, to build bridges between the officers and the community, and yet his son, his own flesh and blood, had become a victim of the very biases he fought against. "I've worked my whole life to make this place better," David said, his voice low but resolute. "But what happened today proves we still have a long way to go." Jason leaned forward, his voice calm but firm. "Dad, this isn't just about today. It's about what happens to people like me every single day. You've taught me to stand up for what's right, but sometimes it feels like the world doesn't care." David nodded, his jaw tightening. "The world needs to care, Jason, and I promise you we're going to make them listen." David called a meeting with the entire department, including Officer Thomas Bradley. The officers shuffled into the briefing room, some exchanging uneasy glances. They had heard whispers of what had happened, and the tension in the room was palpable. David stood at the front, his posture commanding attention. Jason sat to the side, observing as his father addressed the department. "Yesterday," David began, "one of our officers made a grave mistake. He judged someone based on their appearance, not their actions. That someone was my son, Jason Carter. But this isn't just about my son. This is about the culture we've allowed to fester in this department." David's gaze swept across the room. "I've spent years trying to build a force that serves this community with integrity and respect, but incidents like this undermine everything we stand for. They erode the trust we've worked so hard to build." He turned to Thomas, who sat rigid in his chair, his face pale. "Officer Bradley, you've failed not just as a police officer, but as a representative of this department. Your actions were driven by bias, not evidence, and that's unacceptable." Thomas tried to defend himself. "Chief, I didn't mean." "You didn't mean to get caught," David interrupted sharply. "But your intent doesn't matter. The impact of your actions does. You owe Jason and this entire community an apology." Thomas turned to Jason, his voice shaking. "I'm sorry. I let my assumptions cloud my judgment, and I was wrong." Jason nodded but didn't respond. He wasn't ready to accept the apology, not yet. David addressed the room again. "This department will not tolerate racial profiling or any form of discrimination. Starting today, every officer will undergo mandatory training on implicit bias and community engagement. We are here to protect and serve, and that means serving everyone equally." The room was silent, the gravity of David's words sinking in. For many of the officers, this was a wake-up call, a moment to reflect on their own behavior and the changes they needed to make. After the meeting, David and Jason stepped outside. The afternoon sun cast a warm glow over the precinct, a stark contrast to the storm of emotions they had just navigated. "I'm proud of you, Dad," Jason said quietly. "For standing up for what's right." David placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "I'm proud of you too, Jason. You handled this with courage and dignity, and together, we're going to make sure things change for everyone." As they walked away, a few of the younger officers approached Jason. One of them, a rookie named Officer Malik, spoke up. "Jason, I just wanted to say I'm sorry for what happened. People like you remind us why we need to do better." Jason offered a small smile. "Thank you. Just make sure it doesn't happen to someone else." Over the next few weeks, Chief David Carter took decisive action to ensure that the events surrounding Jason's arrest weren't forgotten. True to his word, he initiated a series of changes within the department, starting with mandatory bias training for all officers. The sessions were led by community leaders, educators, and even individuals who had faced discrimination firsthand. The stories shared during these trainings were raw and powerful, forcing the officers to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. Jason, at his father's encouragement, attended one of these sessions. He sat quietly at the back, listening as speakers recounted their experiences. A young black man shared a story eerily similar to Jason's, describing how a simple walk home had turned into a nightmare of suspicion and hostility. When the session ended, one of the officers approached Jason. It was Officer Malik, the rookie who had apologized to him earlier. "Jason, I just want to say, hearing these stories really opened my eyes. I didn't realize how much harm we can cause, even without meaning to." Jason appreciated the sincerity. "Change doesn't happen overnight," he said, "but the fact that you're willing to listen and learn, that's a start." Meanwhile, Officer Thomas Bradley was facing his own reckoning. After his actions were reviewed by an internal panel, he was suspended without pay and required to attend extensive training before being allowed to return to duty. The once confident officer now found himself humbled, his reputation tarnished. He struggled to reconcile his past behavior with the consequences he was now facing. Despite his suspension, Thomas began to reflect deeply on his actions. He attended every training session, listening intently and even volunteering to share his own story of prejudice and mistakes. It wasn't easy, but he knew that redemption required effort and accountability. In the community, news of the incident and Chief Carter's swift response sparked widespread discussions. Some praised David for his transparency and dedication to justice, while others questioned whether meaningful change could truly take root in the system. David knew that skepticism was natural, but he was determined to prove that change was possible. One evening, David organized a community forum at the local recreation center. The event was open to everyone, giving residents a chance to voice their concerns and ideas for improving police-community relations. Jason attended with his father, sitting in the front row. The room was packed, the air buzzing with anticipation. David stepped up to the podium, his voice steady but passionate. "I've called this forum because change doesn't happen in isolation. It takes all of us police officers, community members, parents, and leaders working together to build the trust we need." Residents took turns speaking, sharing their fears, frustrations, and hopes. One elderly woman, Ms. Clara, stood up and pointed at David. "Chief Carter, I've lived here for 40 years, and I've seen it all, but I've never seen a leader take responsibility the way you have. That gives me hope." The crowd erupted into applause, and David nodded humbly. "Thank you, Ms. Clara. But this is just the beginning. Real change will come when stories like Jason's are no longer a reality." Jason felt a surge of pride as he watched his father navigate the room with grace and determination. For the first time, he truly understood the depth of his father's commitment, not just to the department, but to the entire community. Outside the forum, a group of young students approached Jason. One of them, a boy named Tariq, looked up at him with wide eyes. "You're the chief's son, right? What happened to you was messed up." Jason knelt down to Tariq's level, smiling warmly. "It was. But things are going to get better. And if you ever feel like you're being treated unfairly, speak up. Your voice matters." Tariq nodded, his expression serious. "Okay, I will." Months later, the Carter family sat together at the dining table, reflecting on everything that had happened. The journey had been emotionally draining but transformative. Jason had witnessed his father's unwavering commitment to justice and saw the beginnings of a shift within the department and the community. Jason, inspired by his father's dedication, found his own way to make a difference. He began volunteering at a youth mentorship program, sharing his story to inspire other young people to stand up for what was right. One day, while Jason was at the community center helping a group of teens with their homework, he saw Officer Malik walk in. The young officer was carrying a box of donated books and supplies for the program. "Hey, Jason," Malik said, setting the box down. "Thought I'd drop these off. Figured the kids might need them." Jason smiled. "Thanks, Malik. It means a lot that you're here." Malik hesitated for a moment, then added, "You know, you and your dad have made a big impact. You've made me rethink a lot about how I approach my job. I just wanted to say thank you." Jason nodded. "It's a team effort, Malik. But I'm glad to hear it." Meanwhile, at the police department, Officer Thomas Bradley was reinstated after completing his suspension and training. Though his return was met with mixed reactions, Thomas was determined to prove he had changed. He approached his work with a new perspective, focusing on building relationships with the community rather than enforcing his own assumptions. One afternoon, Thomas spotted Chief Carter in the precinct hallway. Gathering his courage, he approached him. "Chief, I just wanted to say, thank you for holding me accountable. I've learned a lot, and I'm trying to do better." David regarded him for a moment, then nodded. "Accountability is the first step, Thomas. Keep working at it. Change doesn't happen overnight." The story of Jason's arrest and the reforms that followed became a beacon of hope for other communities facing similar struggles. Media outlets highlighted Chief Carter's leadership, and Jason's involvement in the mentorship program drew attention as well. The Carter family's story sparked conversations across the country about systemic change, the power of accountability, and the importance of standing up for what is right. One evening, as the family gathered in the living room, Jason turned to his father. "Do you think things will ever really change, Dad?" David leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Change is slow, Jason. But every step forward counts. What happened to you shouldn't have happened. But because it did, we've started something that's bigger than us. And as long as we keep pushing, things will get better." Jason nodded, a sense of purpose filling him. "Then we'll keep pushing." David leaned back in his chair, a thoughtful expression on his face. "Change is slow, Jason. But every step forward counts. What happened to you shouldn't have happened. But because it did, we've started something that's bigger than us. And as long as we keep pushing, things will get better." Jason nodded, a sense of purpose filling him. "Then we'll keep pushing."